Hi, and welcome to today's Good e-learning webinar using SRE to implement DevOps, delivered by Peter Madison. So, a little bit about Good e-learning. Well, Good e-learning provides expert training to individuals and large organizations around the world. We are a market-leading specialist in creating high-quality, accredited online training and a multi-award-winning corporate training provider with years of passionate experience. We want to ensure that learning is a journey, not just providing you with certifications, but also providing you with content like webinars and coaching experiences as well. So I'm going to hand over to today's webinar over to Peter.
Thank you, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here. I love giving these talks, and this is one of my favorite topics. So today we're going to be talking all about SRE, and we've got a little agenda here. We'll be running through a quick introduction about who I am and kind of the industry as we see it today. Also a bit about like what SRE is, where it comes from. We'll be talking about some of the principles that we like to follow as SREs, some of the practices, the tools, the methods, and then how you go about actually adopting this into your organization. And then we'll as we tie this into the topic of today, which is that why is this help with your DevOps adoption as well? And then we'll wrap up, and there'll be time for Q&A afterwards. I'm looking forward to this. So who am I? I'm Peter Madison. I'm a consultant, a coach, managing partner at a business transformation consultancy called Zodiac, based out of Toronto, Canada. And we're always happy to have conversations with new people. We focus very much on building smarter teams and more resilient organizations. So when we look at the world that we see today, we've gone through a lot of change in the technology industry over the last 30 years. We've gone from a world where it was very expensive to switch between different types of technology. There was a high initial investment, there was a steep learning curve, and technology was very much disparate islands, which were difficult to manage. Now we've moved into a world where, and we've now gone to, as things have evolved, somewhere where it's more about the emergence of standards. There was a commoditization. There was we came to this economy of scale. The investment horizons, though, at the same time started to shrink. We went from previously looking at like 5 to 10 years, we'd look out into the future, this investment's going to last us for a long time, to more one where we're looking at a shorter investment one. And it's still predominantly CapEx investment, but it's more of a 3 to 5 year horizon. Nowadays, we're really moving into a world, though, where it's more about a cheap initial setup. It's easy to go pull down the services you need, glue them together, and start to build solutions which add value to customers. We're looking more in a world where there's a very cheap initial setup. It doesn't cost much to do this. And we've got very specialized single-purpose services that we can deliver on. And at the same time, the customer has very different expectations from technology too. They don't get what they need as rapidly as they possibly can. They're going to be moving away to something else. And so this is really, we like to describe this as like value delivery. Like we're looking at a world where everything's about the value, and it's the customer's value that we're looking to target. We've also seen in this time, of course, that investment horizons have very much shortened. We've gone from those 5 to 10 year horizons to like 3 to 18 months. We've got to be looking at in a much shorter period of time to understand what's happening, because technology is changing so rapidly. And it's also much more predominantly OpEx driven versus CapEx driven. So that's the kind of an introduction to the space that we're in. So what does all of this have to do with SRE, and what is SRE, and where does it come from? So what's in the name? Like, what does SRE actually mean? Well, the S stands for site. And we're talking about the entire environment that represents the services that you're running. So we're looking at the sites there, and we're talking about how do we make it more reliable? How do we create more reliability in the service? And reliability, as we'll talk about, ties into quality, and it ties into other key aspects of service delivery, which are important when we talk about the value delivery we were just describing. And it's all about engineering, because here we're talking about not just how do we make things more high availability, but like how do we actually engineer reliability. And engineering means that we're actually quantifying and understanding our outcomes, and we're building to improve those outcomes, and we're constantly working at this. So where does SRE come from? Well, in 2003 at Google, Benjamin Traynor found himself in charge of a production team consisting of 7 engineers. And he was tasked with getting more reliability into Google systems. And he did this by taking a slightly different approach. He had the team there in 2003. He looked at it and he said, okay, I'm going to actually say, rather than the traditional, like just operate and maintain everything that comes at you, what if we started to look at engineering reliability and system, working more closely with the development teams, helping them understand what it means to produce a more reliable service, and helping them build out capabilities that would then enable that to happen. And so he described this role as being 50% ops and 50% dev. And so although this was in 2003, it really became much more popular in like the last 6 years or so, when site reliability engineering came to the fore, and Google published this book, which is also available online. So if you want to browse through the chapters, and it describes the SRE journey, the things that they learned, what they discovered, how it works, the kind of problems SREs focus on, the skill sets that they need, and a lot about the underlying thinking and principles that go into site reliability engineering. So why focus on reliability at all? Well, as we were describing, modern systems are very complex, and they've got more complex over time. We build things in order to create those standards, those interactions. It allows us to pull pieces from different places. Modern software is very much built up of libraries and components from many different places that we glue together to build larger, higher level services. And if for our customers, they're relying on that instantaneous service, and we want both sooner and better, not just sooner. It's not enough just to keep pushing out features. We've got to be pushing out high quality features, better value, sooner, safer, happier, as the saying goes. So we want to make sure that we're focused on that. And if we, as the XKCD cartoon shows here, there's this one piece of code that's existing somewhere in your environment that somebody has been maintaining. And if they decide, actually, I'm not going to maintain that anymore, in fact, I'm just going to take it offline and delete that repo, you could find your entire structure falling down. So it's important to understand what goes into building things, what goes into the systems that we're building, how do we go about understanding and engineering more reliability into them. There's also a financial impact to this. I mean, there's a tremendous cost to systems and services being down. In addition to customers having a much easier time of switching to other services, just the service being down and not being able to access it can have a tremendous impact on your financials. So how does SRE relate to other common methodologies in the industry? So let's talk about Agile for a bit. So an Agile organization is a learning organization. The purpose of Agile is to create small increments of learning. How do we create more learning? How do we learn more about the environment? And we can have a different talk sometime about why that is, and how Agile helps you become a learning organization. An SRE, though, is also about building a learning organization, but it's specifically about how do we help the organization learn from what happens in production. So SRE marries very nicely with Agile. It helps with your Agile journey because it's bringing learning back into your delivery teams and helping them understand how the services are operating and what sort of things they're doing. In addition, one of the common things, and Google likes to describe this way, is that when we start to talk about SRE and DevOps, is that the SRE is essentially a class which implements DevOps, where it's a broader class where if we think of DevOps in terms of reducing organizational silos, accepting failure as being normal, implementing gradual changes into your environment, leveraging tooling and automation to help accelerate how development and operations work together, and ensuring that we're measuring and capturing and understanding what's happening within our services, then SRE and DevOps are very, very much the same. SRE is more explicit, however, and it gives you some very concrete ways in which to operate and describe. So some examples of this, if we think of some of the extensions, would be things like thinking of operations as a software problem, managing explicitly by SLOs, and using that to understand how our service is operating, and then working to minimize the amount of toil and manual work within the environment. And we'll talk about these concepts in much more detail as we go through this. So we've had an introduction. We've talked about kind of the way the industry has changed over the years, and how and why reliability is now coming to the forefront as something that we really want to understand and is critical to how we operate and manage services. And we've talked about where SRE comes from and how it came to be and how it relates to other methodologies like Agile and DevOps. And as we go through this, we're now going to switch into looking at some of the principles that underlie SRE. And then that'll give us some indications about, well, how does this actually further build on this, helping you implement DevOps? So let's start with these are 6 principles of SRE. If we think of operations as being a software problem, that we solve things by using software engineering principles, even in operations. Managing by service levels, understanding what is acceptable in the service levels of our application. Having shared ownership. We're not in this on our own. It's not dev and ops. We're together delivering the service. Understanding and reducing the cost of failure. How do we make sure that we're building capabilities that mean that when things do go wrong, we're able to recover faster, and that it doesn't cost us as much when things fail, because we know that they will. How do we eliminate toil? How do we identify toil? How do we eliminate it from our environments? What does toil even mean? And automation everywhere. How do we look at automation, and are there cases where we wouldn't want to automate? So we're going to cover each of these in detail. So first up is operations as a software problem. So what we're talking about here from an SRE perspective is that SREs take a software engineering approach to operations problems. They're not just about operating and maintaining the systems and services that are built and within the organization. They look at, okay, if we have this system here, how do we make sure that we're looking at the engineering and design principles that underlie it, and that we're building out capabilities that will enable those to run more efficiently, more effectively? Do we have common problems that exist across multiple different systems and services that we can build software for to help make it easier and better to run those solutions? Can we look at design patterns? Can we help guide the delivery teams so that they build more reliable systems? Can we help them make decisions as to how reliable those systems need to be? And all of these kind of questions. So the SRE plays a role in helping the engineering teams develop and build better, more reliable solutions, and they use it by applying software engineering principles. When we talk about service levels, this is a critical part of SRE principles. One of the common adoption practices that we see and use is looking at define the SLO. Think of the objectives that we want to meet for the service. We then look at that. How do we manage the services to those SLOs, and then ensure that there are consequences when we miss those SLOs, and that we know what behaviors we need to take. This is a very key and critical piece that we use within all SRE practices, and we'll talk about it in quite some depth as we go through this. So when we look at the competing priorities across the different parts of the organization, there's very much a different focuses within the different parts of the organization, and there's also different metrics, and then there's the use of SLOs. So understanding the reason to have an SLO, why is an SLO valuable to these different layers, is key. So when we go to talk to product and engineering teams, we can describe it to them as being a data-driven way to focus scarce engineering resources. We can say, okay, we know where we want you to focus because this is, from what these service levels tell us, this is where you need to spend that time that you have available to you on improving the product or service. When we go talk to the operations teams, we can talk to them about helping development teams increase velocity without sacrificing quality. We can talk about how do we help accelerate it, make it easier and quicker for the development teams to start to consume operational services. And when we go talk to the business, we can talk to them about, hey, we can show you how it's doing. We can give you customer experience information. We can show you what that looks like. We can help you learn from how your customers are interacting with your production systems. And we can make this visible to the key stakeholders so you can make business decisions about how we move forward. And so I always like to say that we should never talk about us and them. It's all about, it's our business. It's just some of us use technology to implement those business rules. So as we're working together as one whole and we can understand how the organization moves forward, this is very valuable in terms of understanding that service levels can help all of the parts of the organization understand more holistically what's happening. And we talk about shared ownership. So when we talk about shared ownership, Werner Vogel's talked about this idea of you build it, you run it, and Amazon. So this idea that we don't want to have multiple separate teams with segregated responsibilities all across the organization. We want to be working together to ensure that we're delivering a sound and solid service to our customers. So from that perspective, SREs can help bridge the gap. They can help break down the barriers that occur between development and operations, who have very much competing priorities in a lot of organizations. You've got this difference between the developers introducing change all the time. They want to introduce change as quickly as possible, and operations saying, I want it to be stable, I want it to be stable. And unfortunately, one of the common ways we see of operations making that happen is say, well, don't change as much, which is unfortunately the wrong approach. What we want is we want many, many small changes, as we know from DevOps, will actually increase our understanding of operation, will increase the resiliency and reliability of our systems, versus very large and massive changes, which can be very disruptive to our target systems and environments, and cause a lot of the destability that we see and that operations is trying to prevent. So understanding how we work together to have development teams learn from the wisdom of production, how to build the operational capabilities into their systems, is very much a key part of the role that SREs play. Next up in the SRE principles is reducing the cost of failure. So when we talk about reducing the cost of failure, as we were describing earlier, downtime is costly, and customers might go elsewhere. They might say, hey, I'm not going to transact with you. I'm going to go elsewhere. I'm going to do something else. If a particular e-commerce site is down, then say, well, if I can't buy it here and I really need it, I'm going to go to somebody else's site. And you have very little time, like 7 seconds, and somebody might move on to somewhere else. I'm not going to sit around and wait for this site to load. I'm going to go somewhere else. So it's critical. Downtime is very, very costly. Your customers might go elsewhere. Or they might get frustrated and move their services. They might look at other places to get the services you're offering. So how do we solve for this on the SRE side? Well, we look at it by improving observability. And observability may sound like a fancy term for monitoring, but really what we're talking about there is, from a monitoring perspective, where we collect all of the indicators, we understand and collect all the data, we might set thresholds. From an observability perspective, we understand what it takes for the service to operate. We instrument the service and expose what's critical from it so that we know if it's operating in the way that we expect it to do. And so the two are very closely related and overlap, but from an SRE perspective, we're looking to create observability, improve observability into the services and systems we're offering to customers, so that we can understand and reduce the cost of failure, so we know where to focus our time. This in turn leads to us being able to improve MTTR, mean time to repair. We can reduce how long a system is offline for if we understand what it takes to bring it back on, if we understand more about how that system works, how is the service work, how is it deployed, what are the functions, what's critical in order for us to continue to provide service to our customers. Using smaller changes, like reducing your batch size, smaller changes that we can learn from faster, and things like canary deployments, so where we push out a smaller deployment to a limited subset of customers so we can learn whether or not the new version of the service is working the way we expect it. And at scale, you might be doing 10, 20, 30, 40 of these small experiments into your production environments at one time. Not the same as testing in production, but so chaos engineering. So chaos engineering deserves a bit of a mention here, because when we have these large distributed systems and we're looking to learn and we want to learn from production, we need things to fail. And if we want to learn faster, we might want things to fail faster. So chaos engineering is a way of introducing those opportunities for learning by purposefully introducing errors into the system, shutting down services, bringing pieces of the environment down. And this comes out of Netflix, and there's the concept of the simian army, chaos monkey being the most famous and known, but there's a bunch of other monkeys that do different aspects of the environments, like Gorilla Monkey, which will take down entire Amazon availability zones. So you can see, how does my system respond when this happens? Have I built the right resiliency into the system that it can handle these types of failure? And if not, we know what to work on next. Next up is toil. So what do we mean by toil? So toil is really all of the manual things that we do. Is it that every morning we log in at 9 a.m. and restart that service? Is it, do we have manual tasks that we need to log in and configure or write a report, things which could be very much better automated by a human being for many reasons? I mean, if that service has to be restarted every morning at 9 a.m. and the person who's been doing that every day for the last year decides to go on vacation for the first time, all of a sudden your system goes down. And I've seen this happen. So this kind of problem is like exposing this kind of toil, these manual tasks, and starting to remove it, moving it into the system, letting computers do what computers do best, and do the automation, eliminate the toil, do anything that's repetitive and manual and mundane, look for those tasks and get them out of the environment so that they're not being done manually. Automation is obviously a key part of eliminating toil. And it's also very critical when we look at automation to consider, is it worthwhile us doing the automation or not? So for example, if you have a 1 second, a task that takes 1 second and it runs every year, but it's manual. I mean, I can't think of a 1 second task, but if, say, somebody has to press a particular button on the 31st of December every year, then is it worth automating? Well, you can spend 5 seconds on it, maybe, and it's like, probably not. Just like make sure that somebody is doing that and that it's happening. I think your bigger problem there is that people might forget to do it more than anything else if it's happening so rarely. The importance of this thing goes up as you look at it, and we can start to say, okay, how long should we spend on automating something for it to be worth? So not everything necessarily should be automated, but any manual repetitive tasks or things that happen very rarely, but it's critical that they happen. These are the kinds of things we want to make sure get automated so that they do occur and that we don't have to worry about somebody remembering to make them happen, so that we're not having to rely on people doing the right things at the right time. We can rely on the automation to take care of this for us. So we've covered the introduction. We've talked about the industry at large, where it's come from, the kind of changes we've seen over time in the technology. We've talked about where SRE came from, what it consists of, what does it mean. We've talked about 6 principles of SRE, and you'll find those described in different ways in different places, but there's 6 principles of SRE that we can use as a foundation for how SREs should be looking at problems and looking to solve problems. So now we're going to move into talking about specific practices and tools and methods that exist in the SRE space, and how you can apply those. So first up is the SLA, SLO, SLI. We like 3-letter acronyms beginning with the letter S. Anything else isn't good enough. SLA is a service level agreement. So this is an external agreement typically with customer where there is a penalty for exceeding that agreement. So when we talk about SLAs, it's the agreement that often we've made with an external customer that we said, okay, we will deliver we'll deliver the pizza to you in 30 minutes. And if we don't deliver it to you in 30 minutes, it's free. That's an SLA where we've where we've made a guarantee to our customers, and there's a consequence if we fail to do so. From an SLO perspective, SLOs are the objectives that we're looking to internally meet. Not the same as the SLA, but they're the objectives that we want our team internally to meet, which represents the level at which we're willing to allow the service to run. And the SLIs are the real numbers about the performance, like what is it actually now, so that we can understand where we are in that service. And we can use this very simple SLA, SLO, SLI model in many, many different ways. It can be used in the space of looking at tickets that come in and in your service desk and saying, okay, I want 75% of my tickets to be automated, and the remaining 25% allowed to be manual. So if I have 1,000 tickets, I can have 75%, 750 of them automated, and 250 of them can be manual. And I need something to happen if I go over that 250, which brings us to error budgets. Error budgets are a very common concept. So in the SRE space, let's talk about what do we mean by that. So error budgets can be thought of as being, how wrong can we be before we need to take action? So how much error in the system are we willing to tolerate? And so let's walk through this step by step so we can understand it. So if we have a capacity of our service represented by the blue line here, and we have a certain amount of consumption of that service represented by the orange line, which is hopefully less than the blue line, because otherwise we're out of capacity. We have an SLA, which we obviously want to make sure that we don't exceed. And so in this example, if we don't want to fall below that, if we're not able to deliver performance, say if this is a performance bar, we have an SLO, which we want to say, okay, we also want to be above that in order to succeed. And so in this case, we're below it, which means we've failed on our SLO. And our SLI is the point at which we are at right now, or historically over time, the indicator of where we are. And then this piece here, measured by the blue arrow, is our error budget. It's the amount of error we're willing to allow to occur in the system before we have to take action. So if we walk through this as an example, we consider something like 99.5% of web requests must be successful. That could be considered to be the SLA. That's pretty low, but it's using this from an example perspective. Then if we said 99.7% of web requests are successful, that would be our SLI. That's our SLI here. Then we could say 99% of web requests must be successful would be our SLO. So we've got our SLO is harder to achieve than our SLA. It's above it, so we've got the gap. And what we can say is then that if we have 1,000,000 requests, 1,000 of them can fail, which means that's our error budget. So we're allowed 1,000 failed requests. When the 1,001st request fails, remediation must happen. That means we must stop focusing on the other work that we're doing, and we must go and remediate the service to bring it back into compliance with the SLO, so our SLI improves. And that's the error budget policy. So another core concept here that we use from an SRE perspective is we want the error budget to be used. What we don't want is people putting so much redundancy into it that it never gets hit. If we are using up all of that error budget, that means we are going as fast as we can. We are deploying as quickly as we can. We might be causing errors in the environment, but with errors we're willing to live with because we're able to learn and we're going as quickly as we possibly can in deploying things into our, deploying new changes into our production services. So this is a critical concept because it changes the way that we traditionally think about the delivery of service into production environments. If we are, and we're looking at a distributed system, understanding that we're probably always running in some form of degraded state, error budgets give us a way of measuring how much degraded state are we willing to accept. And this is something that will be discussed and negotiated between the SREs and the operations development teams to understand what is that for each service in your environment. So moving on, let's talk about tools. So there are a number of capabilities that enable a lot of this to work within the SRE world. Infrastructure as code is a common one where we talk about the automation of servers and storage and networks in code, and we use tools like HashiCorp's Terraform, Azure Resource Manager, AWS CloudFormation to define what these building blocks or environment look like. It can go higher stack too. Configuration as code is about software and dependencies, ensuring consistent configuration and configuration being maintained, configuration management across all of our systems so that things don't deviate from the norm and that we got more confidence in the state of the target systems. This is especially important from a continuous delivery model where we want to ensure that where we're deploying to is in the state we expect it to be in. Models like containerization very much help with a lot of this. So Puppet, Chef, and Ansible are common tools in this space. Monitoring as code, when we think about all applications in all environments, if we've got these complex services across large distributed systems, understanding how we can then capture and move monitoring as code in with our applications so that we're able to store that alongside it, so we're not separately managing the monitoring in some other system. So this is a key piece to understand too, and a fairly new-ish concept around, hey, rather than have to work out what needs to happen in my monitoring system every time I make a change, if I store that alongside my my code and my service, my application in my source code repository, I can also push this out at the same time. And there are tools like Dynatrace has a tool called Monaco, there's Datadog, and there's various pieces of open source tooling that can enable this to happen. Policy as code is also a fairly newish concept, and there's various ways that this is coming about. And this is about ensuring that I'm doing the pipelines and deployment targets I build are doing the right things, and that they meet my organizational policies and governance criteria. And there's tools like Open Policy Agent and HashiCorp Sentinel are ways of doing this. Sentinel will work inside of your Terraform environments to say, hey, based on this role or this aspect, you're allowed to deploy to here or not to here, or don't do that. And you can set up complex configurations in that. And so these are good tools to take a look at. Okay, so we covered introduction. We talked about industry as a whole, gone through SRE and like what it is, where it came from, talked about the principles underlying it. We talked about various practices, tools, and methods. Now let's switch gears a little and start to talk about how you can adopt this into your environments, and how can you start to actually take advantage of all of this. It sounds great, right? Like it's fantastic. There's all of this wonderful things that you can do to help improve your services. Okay, well, how do you actually adopt it? Well, there was a gentleman called Dixon, also from Google, who's no longer there, but he came up, he was working with a telco, I believe, and he came up with this idea of a hierarchy of reliability. So if you're looking to build out your reliability practice, he suggested starting with monitoring, which is important. Like I understand the telemetry of the systems that I have to it. What are they doing? When are they doing them? Like I remember walking in with a team right after a production outage or release that had gone bad, and they'd spent like 3 hours overnight trying to get the application up and running. And well, how do you know it's working now? It's the middle of the day. And if you don't know it's working right now in the middle of the day, why are you surprised you didn't know that it was working after you did a change in the middle of the night? And why are you doing changes in the middle of the night? That's a separate conversation. Sometimes we have to, but we want to move away from that. Incident response. How do we respond to incidents? Are we building up good incident response practices? Are we practicing our incident response? Do we know what to do when things go wrong? Postmortems, are we learning from when things go wrong? Are we analyzing and looking for things like root cause? We can argue, we can go back and forth and argue there is no such thing as root cause, but are we at least taking the time and the exercise to look at what happened and understand and learn from it so that we can get better? Looking at testing and release processes, and this is looking at how do we validate what's being deployed out? Are we properly testing? Do we have test automation practices in place? Are we reducing the size of our changes? Are we deploying more often? Are we looking at continuous delivery? Are we putting things like feature flags in place? Are we doing all of these kind of practices? Looking at capacity. How do we measure for the capacity that we need? Do we have things like auto scaling and other capabilities in place? How are we managing for increased or reduced capacity within the delivery of the service? What do our development practices look like? Do we have good processing pipelines? Are your reliability engineers, are they helping with the development practices, helping improve development practices? And finally, when we got all the way to the top, you can have looking at reliable products. Are we looking at this from a product perspective rather than a project perspective? There are a number of different implementation models that go along with this. One is this idea of the SRE as kitchen sink, everything SRE. It's the boil the ocean approach, where the SRE has a broad expanse of capabilities, everything from development, design, and requirements all the way through to operational delivery, where their SREs are focused on infrastructure, where they're purely looking at the servers, the pipes, the plumbing, the automation. How do we make infrastructure go faster? The SREs can be focused on tools, looking at tooling and putting tooling into place. They can be focused on the product side of it, looking at how do we develop products? How does the development team work? They can be embedded into teams. They can be specifically dedicated, either embedded into teams or into value streams, and looking at the specific ways of working there and how those happen. And they can also act in a more consulting manner, where you have like a centralized team of SREs who go out and consult with various different areas. In reality, across a large organization, you'll likely have SREs who are operating in all of these different models, and thinking about how you want to operate, how you want to adopt, where you want to start. These can be useful ways of framing that conversation. So let's think about some of the implementation challenges that we run into. One of the first is that if application teams are not bought in to this, that can be a problem. Because, I mean, this is as we were talking about shared ownership, if the application teams want nothing to do with this, it can be very hard to get momentum. So find your friends, start with your champions, find the teams that do want to do this and work there first. Invite over inflict. Don't force people to do things that they don't want to do. It takes two to tango. Separation of duties can be a big problem. If you consider an SRE to be a developer and they have production access and they have access to development code, then that can be a problem. So thinking about the roles and responsibilities and how those are separated in environments where separation of duties is important, like any financial organization, that can be an important piece of it as well. Lacking of the enabling platform can really hamper as well. When we look at what Google does, Google has a huge platform which they standardize a lot of capabilities onto. They've built that up over time, and that's what enables them to go so fast. If you don't have anything like that, looking at how platform engineering can often be a place where SREs first get engaged. Okay, so how does this tie into the implementation of DevOps? So first up, DevOps is first and foremost a cultural shift. And for the cultural shift to work, we don't want large, big bang change. We want small incremental changes, and lots of them, because that will get us there faster, and it avoids a lot of the bad things that happen from the loss in moral confidence. You never know whether you're going to actually succeed or not if you go. That's why so many large transformations fail, because they don't take a small incremental approach. So you want to start small, think big, and that's how we want to approach this. SRE helps because these incremental practices help break down the wall between development and operations and delivery, and all across the organization. They can create a common language for what we mean from service delivery, and that is exactly what we're looking to do with DevOps. So this ties in beautifully to help us implement DevOps. And so this is how we get to the continual delivery of value. The value delivery we're starting to talk about right at the very beginning of the presentation, and that's why this is so critical. And this is why SRE is a fantastic way to go about implementing your DevOps practices. The two work hand in hand. So we've gone through our introduction. We talked about how SRE came from, the principles, practices, adoption. So let's now wrap up and have a bit of a Q&A. So I always like to throw a quote in here, and this is one of my favorites around: we don't rise to the level of our goals, we fall to the level of our systems. And SRE is all about making those systems as strong as they possibly can be in the right places where they need to be strong, so that you're building the right reliability in the right places for the right reasons. And so if we understand this, then it's our systems that we need to focus on and ensure that they are working the way we want them to. So what have we learned? We've learned about what is an SRE. We've talked about where it came from. We've talked about all of the aspects of it, how it relates to Agile and DevOps. We talked about the tools that we use, SLOs, SLIs, SLAs, talking about error budgets. We've talked about infrastructure as code and policy as code, monitoring as code. We talked about all of these different tools that we use as SREs to help improve our environments. We talked about the methods that go along with those, how you implement them, what they might look like. Talked about where to get started in terms of finding the people in the organization it's best to work with, helping them get better at what they do. And we've talked about how to go about implementing this and how this helps with a DevOps training. So with that, I think we're at the end of our presentation, and I will pass it back to Ryan to provide a few last-minute notes.
Thank you very much, Peter. So yeah, if you're interested in all things DevOps and SRE, then come check out the www.goodylearning.com website, where we've got a full suite of accredited DevOps Institute courses, including DevOps Foundation, Leader, SRE Foundation, and Practitioner. And also as well within the IT service management domain, but can be quite relevant within DevOps and SRE, the Certified Agile Service Manager. So what do you get with our product offerings, i.e. our e-learning course as well? All of our training is accredited by the accrediting bodies, which in this case is the DevOps Institute. We provide full tutor support as well. And also exam vouchers are included in all of our accredited courses. And we also provide a free reset as well. But we know, because of the quality of our courses and our 95% success rate, that you won't need that at all. We also provide practice exams as well. And also our e-learning courses are mobile compatible. So what that means is you can consume the content anywhere, anytime at your leisure. So if you're interested as well, then check out our free trials. And just another slide just to show you the in-depth courses as well. So as I've mentioned, you've got your subject matters here that align to the webinar content provided with DevOps and SRE, your Foundation and Leader, SRE, Foundation and Practitioner. And then also as well, something I didn't mention is that it's quite important as well as you're shifting left to ensure that your security is actually integrated in your CI/CD pipeline. You don't want to be in a project where you've done all the hard work and then all of a sudden the last bit of the project, there's some sort of pen test that needs to go on that implements the code into production. And all of a sudden that pen test highlights some sort of moderate or high risk. and then you have to revert back to essentially ensure that that risk is mitigated. So DevSecOps Foundation course can be quite useful there. And also check out our Certified Agile Service Manager. But just to repeat, as I mentioned at the start of the webinar, here at Good e-Learning, we're not just about you getting your certification. Of course, it's extremely important, but we see learning as a journey, and we want to support you as you move forward, i.e. through these webinars, coaching initiatives as well, and so on and so forth. So without further ado, I know you're eagerly anticipating to ask Peter some questions. So Peter, please, off you go, and thank you. So we've had some pre-registration questions here, and essentially I'll just rattle through them very quickly. So Peter, how would you embed SREs into DevOps teams?
This is an interesting question because DevOps teams are a little bit of an anti-pattern in themselves. But if we think about what we were just describing around how SREs operate and the value that they bring to the table, the SRE is really helping with that, getting that learning from production, helping bring in the operations side of the house to help delivery teams start to learn from that. So quite often, when you have this concept of a DevOps team, they quite often are very development focused. Their goal is to basically help delivery teams get product into production, and that's kind of the problem they tend to be focused on, whereas the site reliability engineering function tends to be a little bit more focused on how can we learn from what's happening in production and get that information back into the delivery teams.
So we've got a kind of a practical implementation question, so leveraging the theory that you've spoken about. So how could essentially this organization or an organization define the roles and responsibilities and the volume of work they could manage effectively? So how could they do that, and how many SREs do they need to kind of accomplish defining that?
Well, as I was describing earlier, it's always best to start with small. Find the single thread that you can manage through the organization and build your team around that. How can we find the right people to provide the skills and capabilities to help with that service versus trying to solve it for everybody in the organization all at once? Very much take an approach of invite over inflict and turn to, we want to create the capability, create the understanding within the organization and help upskill people to learn the things that they need to be able to adopt it. So from how much capacity can SREs take on? If you're building that community around this skill set, then they will need to scale as they take on more and more complex services or applications, and you'll need to build the team out to be able to support them in that manner. But you do want to ensure that SREs are aligned to specific services or value streams so they can learn the context of what that service is looking to do so that they can then provide better feedback and better understanding and help with the automating the pain points for operations of that application.
So it aligns to kind of what I mentioned at the end of the webinar, and it's a kind of in the digital world we work in. It's a quite an important or pertinent point. And so, in your expertise and experience, how would you implement cybersecurity into a DevOps pipeline, and how can SRE as well help with cybersecurity?
Well, it's very much a multi-layered approach when you look at cybersecurity in the context of DevOps. So if we think of the various areas of a pipeline and the different places where we can start to introduce different controls to be able to help to understand what's occurring, we want to be able to help identify where there might be security problems as early as we possibly can. And we do this in a number of different ways. if we're looking right up front, we can look at things like SCA type tools like SNCC and others to be able to look for vulnerabilities in the source code directly, like source code analysis type tools. We can look at practices, which are tools are coming to the forefront now to do like kind of the SBOM type thing, like the software bill of materials idea. So that, because I mean, modern software development is very much a case of often gluing lots of different libraries together. So we need to understand what libraries do we have, which ones do we want to use, which ones might we not want to use, how is all of that interconnected? Similar to one of the earlier XKCD cartoons I put into this presentation around the one thing that somebody has thankfully been maintaining since 2003 that you've got inside of your application, and somebody pulls that away and all of a sudden everything crumbles. But so this idea that from a security perspective, we need to understand where are those things so that we can understand if a vulnerability occurs, what are we going to do about it? Then we look as well then for things like SAS scanning and BAS scanning to automate capabilities into the pipelines with observation of how can we learn from that? Is it valuable? Is it giving us the information we need as we're looking along the pipeline? And then other types of technology will very much depend on the particular platform you're looking at, the technology stack that you're looking at as to how we best secure that. Outside of that, if we want to look at how do we then align things like security architecture and design into the pipelines, because you also need to, there can be fundamental security problems with how we've gone about designing a solution. So we need to ensure that we're also aligning that into the delivery teams and providing an understanding of what that might look like. And then outside of that, of course, is your organizational analysis of external threats and other pieces which can also act as feeds into how do we design our applications, how do we secure them, what does that look like, and then organizational management of security as a whole. Does that answer the question for you, Ryan?
Yeah, and we've got a question here that it's essentially, it looks like it's from a practitioner. And so they've recently joined an organization. They're experienced with SRE and the value that it can add. However, the organization isn't. And so they wanted essentially some hints or tips and tricks where essentially you can highlight to the senior stakeholders that the value of SRE in a very short time frame to kind of get commitment and buy-in to be able to get more SRE stakeholders involved, etc. So yeah, in your experience, kind of what have you found works and so on and so forth?
So one of the common drivers often is from where does it hurt? It's like looking for like, where's the pain points? What is it that is breaking in the environment? If people are seeing instability or they've got problems where it's taking a long time to recover, finding some problems like that and getting the data to say, hey, look, we've had a problem, and there's always this consultant answer of it depends, but the piece here is finding something, a pain point that the organization is having, or a particular service, preferably a critical one in the organization, that you can use SRE practices to help solve by helping that team adopt SLOs, helping them define what good service looks like for that system. Then you can show that, hey, to the leaders like we are potentially, for example, losing money because our service is down but due to unexpected outages. We want to be able to get better at maintaining this and learning from what's happening in production. I want to try these practices to show you that this will help us save on operational costs. This is how we will apply it. This is what it would look like. And so you've got a direct set of, hey, this is the outcome we want. These are the objectives we're going to target. This is how we're going to measure it. This is the skill sets we're going to bring to the table to make that work. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, makes sense. And I'm just having a look at the chat and the Q&A. There seem to be no more questions on the chat. Yeah, any more questions from the webinar audience before we make a close? Let me check again. No, so I'd just like to say, first of all, an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, Peter, for presenting today. It was very informative. And that as well, the slide decks and the recording will be sent out to the registrants as well to supplement your learning as you move forward with your SRE journey. So I'll leave it to Peter to sign off the session, but thanks from me.
And thanks from me. It was a pleasure to be here.
Take care. Bye-bye.